What happened when a young cop wrongly accused a veteran of a crime? The shocking fallout ignited nationwide outrage and changed the system forever. The afternoon sun bathed the streets of Eastbrook, where Samuel Carter, a 67-year-old Army veteran, made his way home. His broad shoulders, wrapped in a worn green coat from his service days, carried both the weight of his years and the respect of his community. In one hand, a reusable shopping bag held groceries and supplies for the local youth center. Along the way, he exchanged warm nods, with the florist arranging fresh bouquets, the corner shop owner waving from his door, and the kids on a passing school bus calling his name with grins. But a few blocks away, Officer Jake Reynolds, a 24-year-old rookie, sat in his idling patrol car. His grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't know this man, didn't recognize his familiar presence. And something about his unhurried, confident stride, so sure, so steady, set him on edge. The quiet rhythm of Eastbrook's streets played out as usual. Cars hummed down the road, shop doors chimed open and shut, and neighbors chatted on their porches. Samuel Carter kept a steady pace, his grocery bag swinging slightly at his side. It was a routine he had followed for years, a trip to the store, a stop at the youth center, then home. But a few blocks away, in an idling patrol car, Officer Jake Reynolds sat watching. At 24 years old, Jake was eager but uncertain, a rookie with something to prove. His father, a retired officer, always said, "Trust your gut, son." That's what separates the good cops from the weak ones. And right now, his gut was telling him something was off. The radio crackled, a brief update about a minor theft in the area, a stolen item from a convenience store, nothing major. But as Jake's eyes locked onto Samuel, the timing felt convenient. The man walked with deliberation, but unbothered, like he had nowhere urgent to be. Jake's fingers tapped the steering wheel. Was this the moment he finally showed his superiors he had instincts? That he could stop something before it happened? Without a second thought, Jake flicked on his patrol lights and hit the gas. A sharp burst of the siren split the air before Jake killed the sound, bringing his car to a stop just ahead of Samuel. Samuel's steps slowed. His brows knitted together for a moment, but he showed no sign of fear or nervousness. Around him, a few pedestrians paused, their conversations trailing off as they turned to watch. Jake stepped out, adjusting his belt, his heart thudding harder than he wanted to admit. "Excuse me, sir," he called, his tone more forceful than necessary. Samuel turned to face him, his expression calm, his voice even. "Yes, officer?" Jake's eyes flicked to the bag in Samuel's hand. "Where are you coming from?" Samuel's brow lifted slightly, but his response was steady. "Just left the youth center, picked up some groceries on the way home." Jake nodded slowly, but his gut wouldn't let go. "We've had reports of a theft nearby," he said, his voice tightening. "Do you have ID on you?" Samuel's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something. Not anger, not fear, but something close to disappointment. "Of course," he said, moving slowly as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his veteran ID. Jake took it, running his thumb over the worn edges, his chest tightening. This man was a veteran. Still, he wasn't ready to let it go. Jake handed back the card but narrowed his eyes at the bag. "What's in the bag?" Samuel exhaled through his nose, then, without hesitation, opened it wide. Inside, a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, a pack of markers for the kids at the youth center. Jake felt heat rise to his face. He could feel the watchful eyes of the crowd that had gathered, a few steps back, murmuring, judging, questioning. His chest tightened. This was getting away from him. He couldn't back down now. He had already committed to this suspicion, already created tension that wasn't there before. And in that moment, pride took over where logic should have been. "Stay where you are," Jake ordered, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. "I'm not done yet." Samuel's posture stiffened slightly, not in defiance, but in measured disbelief. "I don't understand," he said, his tone still calm but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. A woman pulled out her phone and started recording. Jake saw it, and his pulse spiked. This wasn't just about him and Samuel anymore. This was about control, about not looking weak, about proving he wasn't just another rookie too scared to act. "Turn around," Jake ordered, his voice hardened now. Samuel's eyes searched his face, as if trying to decide whether to reason with him or let it play out. He lifted his hands slowly, palms up. "Officer, let's not make this worse than it needs to be." But those words, they only pushed Jake further. To him, Samuel's calm wasn't cooperation. It was a challenge. His grip on control was slipping. And when men like Jake lose control, they act before they think. Before he knew what he was doing, Jake shoved Samuel, hard. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Samuel stumbled back, catching himself. His worn green coat shifted slightly as he steadied himself. He didn't fight back. He didn't raise his voice. He simply exhaled slowly, shook his head, and adjusted his coat. But that was too much for Jake. That restraint, that quiet composure, it felt like mockery, like a reminder that Jake was the one losing control. The adrenaline surged. His hands shook, his breathing uneven. And before his brain could catch up to his body, his fist swung. The impact was sickeningly loud. Samuel's head snapped back, and in a blink the respected veteran, the man who had survived wars, hardship, and decades of service, was on the ground, unmoving. A pool of silence followed. Then chaos exploded. For a second, the world stood still. Then chaos erupted. Gasps and shouts of disbelief rang out from the gathered crowd as Samuel Carter's body crumpled to the pavement, his head hitting the concrete with a sickening thud. The worn green coat, the one he had worn since his military days, bunched up beneath him, his veteran ID slipping from his grasp. A woman screamed, her phone still recording. A young man rushed forward, but another bystander held him back. "Wait, let's see if he's okay." Jake Reynolds stood frozen, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his knuckles stinging from the impact. He hadn't meant to hit him that hard. He hadn't meant to hit him at all. But now Samuel wasn't moving. Jake's mind raced. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like a collapsing building. The murmurs turned into outraged voices, demanding answers. "You hit an old man." He didn't even fight back. "Somebody call 911. The young woman with the phone, eyes wide with fury, took a step forward. "You just assaulted a veteran. He did nothing wrong." Jake's stomach lurched, his pulse thundered in his ears. His training, all the drills, all the lectures about de-escalation, felt like a distant memory. His hand shot to his radio, his voice shaky but forced. "Dispatch. Officer needs assistance. Suspect is down." A pause. Then, "Repeat that, Officer Reynolds?" Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Suspect is down. I need backup." The crowd erupted again. "Suspect? He's a damn veteran. He wasn't resisting. You did this. You." A siren wailed in the distance, growing closer. Jake's feet felt like lead, his mind split between fear and panic. Samuel let out a low groan, shifting slightly. The young woman with the phone knelt beside him, her hands trembling. "He's breathing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But he needs an ambulance, now." Jake took a half step forward, then stopped. His training told him to offer aid. But the moment he moved, the crowd tensed, their rage ready to explode. This was no longer just an altercation. This was something bigger, something far worse than Jake had ever imagined. The sirens grew deafening. 2 patrol cars screeched to a stop, their red and blue lights flashing against the storefronts. Out stepped Sergeant Bill Harper, a seasoned officer with 30 years on the force. His eyes took in the scene instantly, the crowd, the veteran on the ground, the panic in Jake's posture. His voice was sharp, no nonsense. "What the hell happened here?" Jake opened his mouth, but no words came out. The young woman with the phone spoke first. "This officer assaulted that man, unprovoked." She lifted her phone. "I got it all on video." Harper's jaw tightened. His gaze flicked to Jake. "Is that true?" Jake stammered, but before he could answer, another officer pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside Samuel. "He's got a pulse, but he's out cold," the officer said. "Ambulance is 2 minutes out." The tension in the air was suffocating. Harper stepped closer to Jake, lowering his voice. "You better tell me exactly what happened." Jake felt like he was drowning. He could still feel the heat in his knuckles, still hear the sound of the impact, and now there was no undoing it. The moment was already captured, already spreading. The world had already seen, and Jake knew his life had just changed forever. The wail of sirens tore through the streets of Eastbrook, the flashing lights casting a harsh glow over the stunned crowd. Samuel Carter lay on the pavement, unconscious, his veteran ID discarded near his open hand. His chest rose and fell shallowly, his head resting against the cold concrete. Jake Reynolds stood frozen, his fingers trembling at his sides. His knuckles still ached from the punch. The crowd pushed in closer, their voices rising with anger, disbelief, and outrage. "You just assaulted a veteran," someone shouted. "He wasn't even resisting. You called him a suspect? This man fought for this country." Jake's heart pounded violently. He had lost control. He had made the kind of mistake that couldn't be undone, and now the entire world was watching. Sergeant Bill Harper pushed through the crowd, his eyes cold and unreadable as he took in the scene. He had been on the force for over 3 decades, and he had seen many things go wrong in the field. But this was different. The air was thick with tension, the weight of what had just happened hanging over the entire street like an impending storm. Harper's gaze landed on Jake, his tone sharp, controlled. "Tell me what happened." Jake opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he say? That he let his pride push him too far? That he saw a man walking home and assumed the worst? The truth would destroy him, and yet the video already existed. The crowd was still recording, phones raised high, capturing every moment, every expression, every decision. Finally, Jake forced the words out. He wasn't cooperating. Harper's expression didn't change. "So you hit him?" Jake's stomach twisted. A low murmur swept through the onlookers. The young woman who had filmed the entire thing stepped forward, her hands shaking with fury. She held up her phone. "This is what happened, Sergeant. We have it all. The world has it all." Harper's jaw clenched. He already knew. This was out of his hands now. The ambulance pulled up, paramedics rushing to Samuel's side. They checked his vitals, speaking in hushed tones. "Severe head trauma. Possible concussion. We need to move him now." Samuel's worn green coat was carefully adjusted, his gray hair slick with sweat as they lifted him onto the stretcher. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, a hushed silence fell over the crowd, and then the silence erupted into chants. "Justice for Samuel! Hold him accountable! This has to stop!" Jake felt like he was suffocating. He had joined the force to make a difference, to be one of the good guys. But now, his name, his face, they would be plastered across every screen in America, and not as a hero, as a villain. Harper turned back to Jake. His voice was low, firm, and final. "Hand over your badge and gun." Jake's breath hitched. "Sir, Now." Jake swallowed, his hands unsteady as he unhooked his badge, placing it into Harper's outstretched palm. The weight of it felt heavier than ever. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, carrying Samuel Carter into the unknown, Jake knew his life would never be the same again. The rumble of anger from the crowd outside Eastbrook Police Department grew louder. As the night deepened, what had started as a gathering of concerned citizens had turned into a movement. The footage of Samuel Carter being struck down had already spread like wildfire, shared across social media, making its way onto national news. The words "Justice for Samuel" flashed across protest signs. "We saw what happened. How many more times does this need to happen? Hold him accountable." Inside the precinct, Jake Reynolds sat hunched over a table, his head in his hands. His badge was gone. His gun was gone. But the weight of his actions still clung to him. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Texts from family, from fellow officers, from numbers he didn't recognize. One message stood out. His father. "Own up to this before it gets worse." Jake swallowed hard. It already was worse. Across town, in a sterile white hospital room, Michael Carter sat beside his father's bed, his hands clenched into fists. Samuel lay there, his face bruised, his head wrapped in bandages. A man who had survived war, injustice, and hardship, now unconscious because of a cop who didn't know when to stop. Michael's jaw tightened. He had spent his career as a civil rights attorney, fighting cases just like this one. But this time it was personal. His sister, Vanessa, sat in the chair across from him, her eyes red from crying. "They took him down like he was nothing, Mike," she whispered, her voice trembling. Michael exhaled sharply, his fury barely contained. Not this time. He opened his laptop, his fingers moving with purpose. The statement needed to be clear, unapologetic, loud. Within hours, Michael's post hit the internet. "My father, Samuel Carter, a retired Army veteran and pillar of this community, was violently assaulted by a police officer while simply walking home. This isn't just about him. This is about a system that allows this to happen again and again. We demand justice, and we will not stop until we get it." The post exploded. Celebrities, activists, even veterans organizations shared it. Hashtags trended. "Justice for Samuel. Veteran not suspect. Hold him accountable." Michael's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Lawyers offering help, journalists requesting interviews, community leaders organizing marches. By morning, the protests outside Eastbrook PD had doubled in size, and Jake Reynolds' name was everywhere. Inside the department, Captain Bill Harper stood over Jake, his expression stone cold. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Jake swallowed hard. His voice was hoarse. "It got out of hand." Harper's eyes narrowed. "That's your excuse?" Jake's jaw clenched, but he had no answer. Harper leaned in, his voice low and sharp. "You're being charged, Reynolds. Aggravated assault, misconduct in office." Jake felt like the ground had vanished beneath him. "What?" His voice cracked. Harper didn't flinch. "We can't protect you, not from this." Reality hit like a tidal wave. He was about to be booked in the very station where he once wore a badge. He was about to become a face on the evening news. He had wanted to prove himself. Instead, he had destroyed everything. And there was no way back. The air in Eastbrook was thick with tension, the weight of Samuel Carter's assault pressing down on the city like a storm cloud ready to break. Outside the police station, the crowd had swelled into the hundreds. What had started as a call for justice had transformed into a movement. Their voices rang out into the night. "Justice for Samuel. Arrest Jake Reynolds. We won't be silent." Inside the precinct, Jake sat in the holding room, his head in his hands. His uniform, once a symbol of pride, felt foreign now. His badge was gone. His gun was gone. But the consequences of his actions remained. Across town, in a hospital room filled with beeping monitors, Michael Carter paced the floor. His father lay still, bandaged, bruised, unconscious. Michael had spent years fighting for justice in the courtroom. But this wasn't just another case. This was his father. His sister, Vanessa, sat beside Samuel's bed, her hands clasped tightly together, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if he doesn't wake up, Mike?" Michael stopped pacing, his fists clenching. "Then we make damn sure they know what they took from us." He grabbed his phone, opened his notes, and began typing. The message had to be strong. It had to be clear. An hour later, his words shook the internet. "My father, Samuel Carter, fought for this country. He dedicated his life to his community. And yet, he was left unconscious on a sidewalk by a man who was supposed to protect him. This is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern. And we will not stop until justice is served." The post went viral instantly. "For justice for Samuel, bar veteran not suspect. Arrest Jake Reynolds." Social media exploded. Celebrities, civil rights activists, and veterans demanded action. By morning, the protests outside the police station had tripled in size. And inside the precinct, Jake Reynolds was finally facing the consequences. Captain Bill Harper stood over Jake, his face unreadable. The booking process was already in motion. Jake could feel the walls closing in on him. He had once worn the badge with pride. Now he would be on the other side of the law. Harper exhaled sharply. "You're being charged." Jake's stomach dropped. "With what?" "Aggravated assault, misconduct in office." Jake's world shattered. Harper's gaze hardened. You want to know the worst part? Jake swallowed hard. Harper's voice was icy. The system protected officers like you for too long. He shook his head. But this time, the world saw. And now, there's no covering this up. As the cell door clanged shut, Jake finally understood. This wasn't just his downfall. This was history in the making. The streets of Eastbrook were no longer just filled with anger. They were filled with determination. Samuel Carter's name had become a rallying cry, his story a symbol of change. At the hospital, a miracle happened. Samuel opened his eyes. The room fell silent as Michael Carter gripped his father's hand, his voice thick with emotion. "Dad, you're back." Samuel's gaze was weak but steady, his voice hoarse. "What happened?" Michael exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "You stood your ground, and now the whole country is standing with you." Outside, the protests had grown into a movement, and inside the courthouse, Jake Reynolds sat in handcuffs, awaiting trial. For the first time in a long time, justice didn't feel impossible, but the fight wasn't over yet. The story of Samuel Carter reminds us that injustice still exists, but so does the power of accountability. As we step into 2025, we must ask ourselves, how far have we come and how much further do we need to go? This isn't just about one officer or one victim. It's about a system that must change. Body cameras, community oversight, and bias training are steps forward, but real change requires constant pressure. If Samuel's story teaches us anything, it's that silence is never an option. Will 2025 be the year we demand better? Or will we let history repeat itself? Samuel Carter's story is more than just an incident. It's a call for justice. His resilience sparked a movement, but the fight isn't over. Now it's up to us. Share his story, demand accountability, and support policies that prevent this from happening again. What should Samuel do next? Should he use his voice to push for police reform? Should he hold town hall meetings to inspire change? Comment below with your thoughts. Every voice matters, and together, we can turn this moment into a lasting movement. Don't let this be just another story. Let's make it a turning point. Justice for Samuel.